My name is Simon. I was 37 when this happened, and I hadn't told anyone about it for years. It happened back in 2016, late in the autumn. I'd taken a week off work, just before the holiday season started to get too busy. I'd been working long shifts in the warehouse, sorting and packing for 12 hours a day, and I needed to get out of the city for a while. I needed quiet, stillness, and time alone to let my head settle. I'd found this cabin listed on an old travel forum that someone had posted years ago. It wasn't on any of the big holiday rental sites. Some guy named Pete, who owned a few acres in Northumberland, had built it years ago and rented it out cheap to people who wanted peace and quiet. I had to call a number and leave a message. Then he called me back the next evening. He told me it was still standing, that no one had used it in a few months, and I could take it for £90 for the week if I didn't mind it being basic. No electricity, no running water. Just a wood stove, a rain barrel, and an outhouse. That's exactly what I wanted. I left early on a Monday morning, just after 5 a.m., and drove north. I packed food that didn't need to be refrigerated, extra layers of clothing, a torch, a couple of books, and a sleeping bag. I didn't tell many people I was going, just my brother, and I didn't tell him the exact location, just said I'd be off-grid for a few days. By mid-afternoon, I was deep into Northumberland. The motorways turned into smaller roads, and then into single-track lanes lined with dry stone walls and wide, empty fields. Eventually, I reached the edge of some dense woodland. Pete had left a small hand-painted sign nailed to a post that just said cabin, with an arrow pointing down a rough dirt track that was mostly covered in leaves. I followed it in my car until the trees got too tight, then parked and hiked the rest of the way in. The cabin was just 100 yards or so further in. Small, maybe 20 feet across. Dark timber, moss on the roof. A thin metal chimney poked out of one end. There was a pile of chopped logs stacked nearby under a tarp. No other buildings in sight, no fences, no lights. The woods were silent except for the wind moving through the trees. It was exactly what I needed. Inside, the cabin was as simple as Pete had said. One room with a small wooden bed frame, a table, a chair, a stove, and some shelves with mismatched plates and mugs. No locks on the doors, just a wooden latch. A single window at the back which looked out into the trees. I dropped my bag, sat down on the bed, and just listened to the silence for a while. I hadn't felt that kind of peace in years. I spent the first 2 days reading, walking, and keeping a fire going. I didn't see another person. I heard some deer now and then, saw birds, even spotted a fox one morning. The weather was gray and cold, but dry. I boiled water from the barrel out back for tea, used the little gas stove I'd brought to heat up soup, and wrote in a notebook I hadn't touched in years. It was on the third night when things changed. That evening, the wind picked up. Leaves scraped against the sides of the cabin. I'd gone out before dark to collect more firewood from the pile and noticed for the first time that there were some older, overgrown trails leading further into the woods, behind the cabin. I remember thinking they might have been game trails, or maybe old footpaths that had grown wild over time. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual because the temperature dropped. I read until my eyes got heavy, then crawled into my sleeping bag on the bed. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night needing to pee. The fire had died down, and the cabin was nearly pitch black, except for the faint orange glow from a few embers. I stepped outside into the cold. The wind had died completely. It was silent. No owls, no rustling leaves, nothing. The moonlight was just bright enough to see the outline of the trees. As I turned to go back inside, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, standing near one of the old trails behind the cabin. Too far to see clearly. Still, no sound, no movement. I froze. My first thought was that it was an animal. A deer, maybe, but it wasn't shaped like one. It was upright, human-shaped, no torch, no light, just standing there. I stared for maybe 20 seconds, eyes adjusting to the dark. The figure didn't move. I slowly stepped back inside and shut the door, heart thudding in my ears. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the chair with the fire going, staring out the window. By dawn, I told myself it had been my imagination. Maybe a tree. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me in the dark. I made tea, ate some oats, and walked out to where I thought the figure had been. There was nothing there. No footprints, no broken twigs, no sign of anyone. The path was thick with old leaves. Whatever it had been, if it was anything, had left no trace. I spent the day trying to shake it off. Went for a long walk. Sat by a stream for a while. When I came back to the cabin, I brought more wood in and made sure I had my torch and a knife from my camping gear close by. That night, I stayed inside. I lay on the bed, torch nearby, fire lit, eyes wide open. I didn't sleep. Just after midnight, I heard something. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. Footsteps, leaves crunching, slow, close. I got up, heart pounding, and stood near the window, staring out. I couldn't see anything. Then I heard it again, just behind the cabin. Soft, slow steps, not an animal. Too heavy, too measured. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then they stopped. I stood like that for maybe 10 minutes. No sound. Then I heard a knock. Not on the door, on the wall, the outside wall of the cabin. 2 knocks. Low, hollow. Then silence. I didn't go outside. I didn't move until the sun came up. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. I checked the trees, the ground. Again, nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I knew I had heard someone walking, knocking. The rest of the day I was on edge. Every sound made me jump. I kept checking over my shoulder when I was outside. That afternoon, I decided to cut my trip short. I couldn't take another night like that. I packed up most of my things, ready to leave the next morning. But that night, I don't know why, I stayed. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself it was nothing. Maybe I didn't want to drive tired. Maybe I was just stubborn. It was the worst decision I've ever made. Around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps again. But this time, they didn't stop at the wall. They circled the cabin. Soft steps moving from one side to the other. I grabbed my knife, lit the torch, and crouched near the door. Then I heard the latch move. Just a little, just a rattle. Someone testing it. Then silence again. I stood there for what felt like hours. Eventually, I opened the door. No one. I shined the torch into the trees. That's when I saw her. A woman, maybe 50 feet away, standing behind a tree, just barely visible. She wasn't moving. She wasn't trying to hide. Just standing, her face barely lit by my torchlight. Long hair, pale face, wearing something loose that moved slightly in the breeze. I froze. She didn't move. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, breathing hard. Then she stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I didn't sleep. I didn't sit down. I waited for morning with the fire lit and the knife in my hand. When the sun came up, I threw everything into my bag, didn't even bother cleaning up, and left. As I walked back to the car, I kept checking behind me. I didn't see her again. When I got to the car, I started it and drove straight out of there without stopping. A few days later, I called Pete. I didn't tell him everything. I just said someone had been wandering around out there at night. He didn't sound surprised. He said he'd had a few guests leave early over the years. Said maybe some of the old neighbors didn't like strangers in the woods. That was all. I never went back. I still don't know who she was. She didn't try to break in. She didn't speak. She just watched. But that was enough. For months afterward, I couldn't sleep without checking the windows. I'd flinch at any knock on the door. I'd find myself staring into dark corners, expecting to see her face. But slowly it faded. Now it's been nearly a decade. I live in a different place, a different life. But sometimes, if I'm out walking alone and the woods go quiet, I still feel like I'm being watched. And I never rent remote cabins anymore. Ever. I had never been one for rustic, old cabins. The creaky floors, the dusty air, the thick smell of old wood. It all felt too isolated, too close to something forgotten. But after my grandfather passed away, I found myself standing in front of his cabin on a forgotten stretch of farmland just outside of Springfield, Missouri. It was January, and the snow had already started to fall heavier than I had expected. The kind of snow that doesn't stop until the roads are barely visible, and the world feels like it's been smothered by a thick, cold blanket. The cabin had been in the family for years, but it was never really a place anyone visited often. My dad had grown up here, but after he left for college, the place was left to fall into disrepair. And now it was mine, or at least that's what the lawyers said when they handed me the keys. At 32, I wasn't exactly thrilled to be inheriting a place that felt like a relic, but I needed to figure out what to do with it. My life had become a mess of empty rooms and faded memories, so the thought of going out there to sort through my grandfather's belongings felt like a good way to clear my head. I parked my truck in front of the cabin and stared at it for a long time. The wind whipped through the trees, and the snowflakes seemed to come at me sideways. The house was small, made from large wooden beams, worn and weathered from decades of neglect. The roof sagged slightly in places, and the windows looked like eyes, dark, empty, and watching. There was no cell service out here, which was both a relief and a bit unnerving. The cabin sat in the middle of a few acres of land, with fields stretching out on all sides. It was the kind of place where you could hear every little sound: the creak of the trees, the howl of the wind, the crunch of snow underfoot. And tonight, it felt like the place was alive, breathing, groaning under the weight of its age. I stepped out of my truck, feeling the bite of the cold air on my face. The wind cut through my jacket, and I pulled my gloves tighter, my breath forming clouds in the air. As I approached the door, I hesitated. The place was too quiet, too still. Even the snow seemed to fall in silence, muffling everything. I fumbled with the old key in the lock before it finally gave way with a heavy groan. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the scent of musty wood and old, stale air hit me like a punch. The inside was just as I remembered, dark and neglected, with the remnants of a life left behind. My grandfather's old chair sat near the fireplace, the cushions sagging from years of use. There was a faint, lingering smell of tobacco, something that had been part of the place for as long as I could remember. I stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind me. I turned on the light, but the bulb flickered and buzzed before going out completely. Great. I'd forgotten how much the place needed work. There was no way to ignore it now. The power had been off for months, maybe even longer. I found the small gas-powered lantern in a corner and lit it, watching as the flame flickered to life, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The inside of the cabin was cramped, with the kitchen off to one side and the living area on the other. Everything seemed frozen in time, the furniture covered in a thick layer of dust, the floors creaking under every step. I wandered through the rooms, running my fingers over the surfaces, trying to take in everything that was left behind. My grandfather had never been much of a talker, and his belongings reflected that. There were few pictures, even fewer mementos. Just the basics: a couple of worn-out books, a chipped mug, a collection of tools that had been left in disarray. By the time I made my way to the back of the cabin, the daylight was beginning to fade. The sky outside was overcast, and the shadows in the cabin deepened. I wasn't sure if it was the solitude or the unsettling silence, but I started to feel uneasy, like I was being watched. I pushed the thought away and focused on the task at hand. I needed to sort through the old boxes in the attic and get a sense of what had been left behind. The sooner I did that, the sooner I could leave. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and made my way to the stairs leading up to the attic. The stairs creaked as I climbed, and the air grew colder the higher I went. At the top, I found the hatch to the attic, and I hesitated for a moment before pulling it open. Dust fell in clouds as I climbed into the attic. It was dark and cramped, the air thick with the scent of mildew. The floor was covered in old, forgotten things. Boxes, trunks, and stacks of papers that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I pulled one of the boxes closer and started sorting through it. There were old clothes, faded letters, and a few items that seemed more like junk than anything valuable. But then I came across something strange. Buried beneath a stack of old newspapers was a small, worn-out journal. I couldn't place it at first, but the moment I touched it, a chill ran down my spine. The leather cover was cracked and weathered, the pages yellowed with age. I flipped it open, scanning the handwritten notes inside. It was my grandfather's handwriting, but the words seemed strange, disjointed. There were random notes about the weather, about the farm, about his life. But then, toward the end, the writing took a darker turn. Asterisk. I hear footsteps outside, even when no one is there. The wind whispers in the trees at night. I don't trust the neighbors. They're hiding something. Asterisk. The words felt like a punch to the gut. My grandfather had never spoken of anything like that. He'd always been a quiet man, but never paranoid or afraid. I read on. Asterisk. Last night, I saw something in the field. It was tall, too tall. It moved like a shadow, but it wasn't a shadow. I don't know what it was, but I don't want to find out. I can feel its eyes on me. Asterisk. I stopped reading, my hands trembling slightly. It didn't make sense. My grandfather had lived out here for decades, and as far as I knew, he hadn't been involved in anything strange. He was a farmer, a simple man. The idea that he had been scared of something out there, something he couldn't explain, was unsettling. I glanced around the attic, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The air felt colder now, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. I tucked the journal into my bag, deciding I needed to look into this further. I didn't know what my grandfather had seen, but I had to figure it out. I descended from the attic quickly, eager to leave the cramped space behind. As I moved through the living room, I caught a glimpse of something through the window, a figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it again, standing in the far corner of the field, barely visible through the snow. The figure was tall, too tall, and it seemed to be watching the cabin. My heart began to race, and I moved away from the window, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The snowstorm outside had picked up, and I could barely see anything beyond the cabin. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the storm, but the image of that tall figure stayed in my mind. The journal's words echoed in my head. Asterisk. I can feel its eyes on me. Asterisk. The night passed slowly, the wind howling through the trees outside, and the cabin creaking and groaning with every gust. I didn't sleep much, keeping the lantern burning low by my side. But as the night dragged on, I started to hear things. Footsteps outside, faint and distant, but unmistakable. I didn't know what was out there, but whatever it wasn't going away. The next morning, I packed up my things, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling in my gut. As I drove away from the farm, I glanced back at the cabin. The tall figure from the night before was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me the entire time. I didn't go back to the cabin after that. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't ignore the sense that whatever my grandfather had written about, whatever he had feared, was still out there waiting. I'd never find out what it was, but I didn't need to. Some things are better left unknown. I never planned to spend a night in the woods alone, not after everything that had happened last year. But life had a way of pushing me into uncomfortable places, and the cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect escape. I needed the silence, the isolation. I was hoping the solitude would clear my mind, bring me back to myself after everything that had gone wrong. The cabin was old, made of heavy logs and surrounded by towering trees. It wasn't much, just a small structure with a roof that creaked every time the wind blew. The woods stretched for miles in every direction. I had driven for over 2 hours from the nearest town to get here, passing nothing but forest and the occasional worn-down dirt road. There was no cell service, no real signs of civilization for miles, just the woods. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky darkening quicker than I had expected. There was a chill in the air that made my breath visible in front of me, despite it being only October. I unloaded my gear from the back of my truck, taking my time. I'd been here once before, about a year ago, when my uncle had invited me to stay with him. He was the one who built the place years ago, but he had passed away last winter, leaving the cabin abandoned. The idea of returning didn't sit well with me, but I wasn't about to let that stop me. It felt like a final farewell to him, or maybe a way to confront the memories that had been haunting me. The place looked exactly as I remembered, rustic and lonely. The wood had darkened with age, and the front porch was covered with thick layers of dust. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. My heart was already racing, though I didn't know why. It was as if the cabin itself was trying to pull something out of me. Inside, everything was the same. The heavy oak furniture, the worn-out rug, the stone fireplace. I set up my cot near the window, unpacking my things as the last of the light faded away. The temperature dropped quickly as the sun set behind the trees. A cold wind whistled through the gaps in the cabin, and the air felt thick with moisture, making the wood groan and sigh. I lit the fireplace, the crackling fire offering the only source of warmth. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves and making the trees sway unnervingly. I kept the door shut tight, more out of instinct than any real reason to be afraid. But my mind kept wandering back to the last time I was here. It was a weekend trip with my uncle. He'd been acting strange, quieter than usual, and I noticed he'd been checking over his shoulder a lot. At the time, I had brushed it off, thinking it was just old age. But now, as I sat in the same cabin, the feeling that something was wrong crept up on me once again. The air felt too still, too heavy. Around 10 p.m., I decided to go outside and take a quick walk around the property to get some fresh air. The fire was still crackling behind me as I stepped out onto the porch, the cold biting at my skin. The forest loomed, dark and silent, with only the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. I walked to the edge of the property, toward the tree line, scanning the woods for any signs of movement. But everything was still, and after a while, the unsettling feeling started to fade. I was just about to turn back when I heard something, a faint sound coming from deep in the woods. It was hard to make out at first, but there was a rustling noise like something or someone was moving between the trees. My heart skipped a beat. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the direction. The rustling came again, this time louder, closer, and then a crack. I froze. I had learned enough from hiking in the wilderness to know that certain sounds could be attributed to animals. Branches snapping underfoot, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But this was different. This was deliberate. I was about to head back to the cabin when I saw a shadow move in the corner of my eye, just outside the tree line. I immediately froze, my stomach knotting with fear. There, just beyond the reach of the firelight, was a figure. Tall, thin, and completely still. I couldn't make out any details, just the dark shape of someone, or something, standing among the trees. I should have gone back inside, locked the door, and forgotten about it. but curiosity won over. I moved toward the figure, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves underfoot. With every step, the figure seemed to grow more distant, as if it was retreating deeper into the woods. My instincts told me to stop, but I couldn't. Not yet. As I got closer, the shadowy figure disappeared behind a thick patch of trees, vanishing into the night. I stood there, staring at the spot where it had been, trying to understand what I had seen. It didn't feel right, like it wasn't supposed to be there. My chest tightened, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I backed away slowly, feeling the weight of the woods around me. It wasn't until I reached the porch that I heard the sound again, this time unmistakable. The crunch of footsteps on dry leaves, not far behind me. I slammed the cabin door shut as quickly as I could, locking it with shaking hands. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, listening for any further sounds. But the night was still. The wind howled in the distance, and the fire crackled in the fireplace. But otherwise, there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement. I stayed up for hours, my mind racing. The logical part of me told me it was probably just an animal or some other hiker, but the feeling of being watched never left. At around 3 a.m., the silence was broken again, this time by something much louder. A thud, followed by another, and another. It was coming from outside, from the side of the cabin, near the back. I grabbed the rifle that my uncle had left behind, not that I knew how to use it properly. The thuds continued, each one closer, and each one making my blood run cold. I crept over to the window, careful not to make a sound. My breath fogged up the glass as I peered out into the darkness. What I saw made my heart stop. There, standing by the edge of the cabin, was a man. Not just any man. A tall figure with long, ragged clothes and wild, unkempt hair. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could see the outline of his body. He was leaning against the cabin, almost as if waiting for something. His presence was wrong. There was nothing human about the way he stood, the way he moved or didn't move. I dropped the rifle, my hands trembling as I backed away from the window. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront him? Should I run? Before I could decide, the man moved. Slowly, he began to walk around the cabin, his footsteps dragging with a heavy, unsettling rhythm. I heard him stop near the back door, and then silence. I didn't dare open the door. I stayed in the cabin, watching the shadows creep across the trees as I waited for morning. But when the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the trees, I looked outside, and the man was gone. It didn't make sense. I knew I had seen him, but there were no tracks, no sign of anyone having been there. It was like he had never existed at all. The rest of the morning passed quietly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I spent the rest of the day packing up my things, eager to leave the cabin behind. As I drove away, I glanced at the woods one last time, the cabin disappearing behind the trees. I couldn't explain what had happened that night. I didn't know if it was my mind playing tricks on me, or if something else had really been out there. But I had no desire to find out. I learned that night that some places, some memories are better left alone. Some things are better forgotten. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a getaway from the usual routine. Nothing fancy, just a cabin in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place you go to clear your mind, enjoy nature, and leave the chaos of everyday life behind. I had booked the cabin in the remote woods of Colorado. It was a small, wooden structure tucked away far from the nearest town. The cabin had been a family-owned retreat for years, rented out to anyone looking for solitude. The thought of peace and quiet was exactly what I needed, especially after the rough few months I had at work. My name is Jack Miller, and I'm 35 years old. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest. The air was crisp and the smell of pine filled my lungs. The drive had taken longer than expected, but I was used to being alone, and the journey didn't bother me much. When I pulled up, the cabin looked exactly like I had imagined. Weathered, but solid. It had a stone chimney, a small porch, and wide windows that overlooked the vast expanse of trees. I got out of my truck, stretching my legs. The ground crunched underfoot as I grabbed my bags from the back. The first thing I noticed was the stillness of the place. It was so quiet, the kind of silence you feel deep in your bones. Not even birds were chirping. That's when I realized I hadn't heard a single animal since I entered the woods. No squirrels, no birds, not even the distant rustling of a deer. It was unnerving, but I shrugged it off as part of the remoteness. It wasn't unusual for places like this to feel eerie, especially when you're used to the noise of the city. The inside of the cabin was cozy, though a little worn. The floors creaked with every step. The furniture was older but well kept, and there was a faint smell of wood and dust. I set my bags down, kicked off my boots, and went to explore the place. The living room had a fireplace with a few logs stacked beside it, just waiting for a fire. The kitchen was stocked with basic supplies. A quick glance through the windows confirmed what I already suspected. Nothing around for miles. The closest neighbor was a good couple of miles away, and the cabin was surrounded by dense forest on all sides. I decided to take a walk before night fell. I grabbed my jacket and went outside. The temperature had dropped quickly, and the breeze made the trees sway slightly. As I walked along the trail that ran behind the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I told myself I was just being paranoid, the product of too many horror stories and late-night crime documentaries. But the feeling of being watched lingered. The trees seemed to stand too still, and the ground underfoot felt unnatural, like it wasn't meant to be walked on. I didn't want to make a habit of letting my mind wander like that, but the silence was suffocating. My footsteps sounded too loud in the stillness. The forest felt closed in, like it was waiting for something. I turned around and headed back to the cabin, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere. That night, I sat by the fireplace, reading a book I had brought along. The wind howled outside, but the cabin was warm and safe. I thought about heading to bed early, but something kept me from it. It wasn't until I heard the first noise that I really began to feel uneasy. At first, it was a soft sound, almost like a twig snapping far off in the woods. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just an animal. But then I heard it again, closer this time. The noise was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It was the sound of something walking, and whatever it wasn't an animal. I stood up, heart racing. My mind spun with possibilities, most of them not very reassuring. I told myself it was nothing. It was probably just a person, maybe someone else staying nearby. But the idea didn't sit right with me. I peered out the window, scanning the forest, but I couldn't see anything in the fading light. The shadows stretched across the ground, making it impossible to tell what was out there. Another snap. This one was unmistakably closer. I froze. I wasn't sure what to do. If it was someone else, they'd likely see the lights inside the cabin. If it was an animal, I figured I'd be fine, as long as I didn't go outside. But the sound, it didn't fit either of those. It was too consistent, too controlled. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air bit at my skin, and the trees loomed in every direction. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't feel like enough. It was as if the forest was pushing back against the light. I called out, but my voice was swallowed up by the vastness of the woods. Nothing answered. As I stood there, trying to get a better sense of what was happening, I heard it again. The sound of someone walking. This time, it was definitely closer, close enough that I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The footsteps weren't fast. They were slow, deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was out there was taking their time. I scanned the trees, the flashlight bouncing around as I tried to focus on the source of the sound. That's when I saw movement. A figure stepped into the edge of the light. For a moment, I thought it was a person, but then my stomach dropped. It wasn't human. The figure moved like it was trying to hide, creeping between the trees. His body was hunched low, almost crawling. But it wasn't an animal. I could tell that much. The shape was too large, too wrong. There was something deeply unnatural about it. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen in place. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The thing seemed to sense my gaze. It stopped, standing still, and for a moment, I thought it was going to charge. But it didn't. It simply stood there, motionless. I don't know how long we stared at each other, but every second felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, the thing bolted. It was fast, faster than anything I had ever seen. It darted through the trees, and I couldn't track its movements. All I heard was the rustling of leaves and the thumping of its feet on the ground. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the dark, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't go back inside the cabin right away. I stood there, frozen in place, listening. The forest was eerily silent again. No more sounds, no more footsteps, just the wind. I felt sick to my stomach, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was no way I was going back into that cabin. I didn't feel safe there anymore. I spent the rest of the night outside, watching, waiting. I tried to stay alert, to listen for any more movement. But nothing came. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I was exhausted and shaken. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't safe. It was hunting me, and I didn't know why. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a soft glow over the forest. Everything looked so peaceful, but I couldn't forget what I had seen. The thing in the woods, it wasn't something I could explain. It didn't make sense, and I didn't want to stay around long enough to find out more. As I drove away from the cabin, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see it in the rearview mirror. But it was gone. There was no sign of it, nothing that indicated anything had been out there. Only the quiet, empty woods, stretching endlessly in every direction. It wasn't until I reached the nearest town, hours later, that I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. The moment I pulled into the gas station, I stepped out of my truck and made my way to the cashier. Couldn't help it. I had to ask, "You ever heard of anything strange happening out by those old cabins?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The cashier looked up at me, his eyes narrowing. "Strange? You mean like the Skinwalkers?" My heart skipped a beat. "Yeah," he said, nodding slowly. "They're known to wander around these parts. Not many people stick around for long once they realize what's out there." I didn't need to hear more. I paid for my gas, climbed into my truck, and drove off. I wasn't going back, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever be the same again. Whatever I had seen in the woods that night, I would never forget it. The memory of those eyes, the unnatural movements, the feeling of being hunted. It haunted me, but I was alive, and I had no intention of tempting fate again. Some things are better left undisturbed. I wasn't sure what possessed me to take this trip. My mind had been set on a peaceful weekend retreat, far from everything. No distractions, no phones, no noise. Just me, the wilderness, and a small cabin in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place people rent when they want to get away from it all. It was late fall, the kind of season when the air is crisp and biting, and the leaves turned that perfect shade of amber and orange. I'd rented the cabin through an old friend of a friend who seemed to know a lot of people in the area, even though it was a small town in the middle of Montana. Cabin 7, the listing called it, a secluded, one-room log cabin with a fireplace and a porch that overlooked the thick woods. The drive was long, about 4 hours from the nearest city, but it gave me time to clear my head. I'd been dealing with a lot of stress at work. Things were crazy, and my relationship with Emily, my girlfriend of 3 years, had been on the rocks for a while. She didn't understand why I needed to get away, but I couldn't explain it. Sometimes you just need to be alone. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of red and purple. The road was nothing more than a gravel path, a thin line cutting through the wilderness. The forest around me felt endless, like it stretched on for miles in every direction. There was no cell service, no signs of civilization, just the quiet hum of nature. The cabin was just as the pictures had shown. A cozy little place made of weathered logs, its chimney puffing a faint trail of smoke into the sky. It looked peaceful, isolated, like a place where you could let go of everything and simply exist. The owner, a man named Rick, had left the key under the doormat, which was oddly fitting for such a remote spot. I set my bags inside and lit the fireplace, feeling the warmth quickly spreading throughout the room. There was a small kitchenette in the corner with just enough supplies to make a simple meal. The place was clean and well kept, and the only sign of life I could see were the few birds flying past the windows, heading south for the winter. I unpacked, set up my things, and made myself a quick dinner of canned chili and some crackers. As night began to settle in, I sat by the fire, listening to the crackle of the wood and the occasional gust of wind outside. The stillness was almost too much, too quiet. No sounds of cars, no distant chatter, just the rustling of the trees. It made me feel like I was the last person on Earth. By the time I finished eating, it was pitch black outside. The only light came from the fire and the few stars that managed to peek through the thick canopy of clouds. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, and I could hear something moving outside, the faint, muffled sound of branches scraping against each other. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that crept up my spine. I wasn't used to being so isolated. The woods felt alive, like they were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I decided to turn in early. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and the blankets smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. It wasn't long before I fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was just a dream, but then I heard it again, a sharp, unmistakable noise. It was a knock. Someone was knocking at the cabin door. I froze. I glanced over at the clock on the nightstand. 2:15 a.m. Who would be out here at this time of night? There were no other cabins nearby, no neighbors to speak of. The road was barely passable for most vehicles. I had driven the whole way without passing a single other soul. So why would anyone be knocking at my door? I lay there listening. The wind had died down, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. Then the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I carefully got out of bed, trying not to make a sound. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be someone who had gotten lost? Maybe a fellow camper in trouble? But no one else should have been out here. I grabbed the heavy flashlight I'd brought with me and cautiously approached the door. I cracked it open just enough to see if anyone was standing there, but no one was. Only the empty porch, the dark woods beyond. Still, something didn't feel right. I stepped out into the cold night air, the flashlight in my hand trembling slightly. The porch creaked beneath my feet, and I scanned the area. The wind had picked up again, rustling the leaves, but there was no sign of life, no footprints in the dust, no movement. My breath came out in short puffs, freezing almost instantly in the night air. I turned back to the door to head inside, but then I saw something that stopped me cold. On the ground near the edge of the porch, half hidden in the shadows, was a small bundle of twigs. But as I leaned closer to inspect it, I realized that they weren't just twigs. They were human bones, brittle and cracked, wrapped in what looked like an old, tattered cloth. My stomach turned. What in the hell? I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd heard rumors about this part of the country. Stories about people going missing, strange happenings in the woods, but I never took them seriously. I had thought they were just ghost stories, the kind of things people tell to freak each other out. But this felt real, too real. I closed the door quickly and locked it. The knocking had stopped, but now I was wide awake, my mind spinning with thoughts of who had left that bundle on my porch, and why. The following day was no better. I spent most of the morning pacing around the cabin, trying to convince myself that I had just imagined the whole thing. Maybe I had dreamed the knocking, maybe the wind had caused the noise, but I couldn't get the sight of those bones out of my head, and that strange feeling that I wasn't alone. I ventured out to explore the woods, hoping to clear my head. The forest around the cabin was thick, with towering pines and patches of underbrush. It smelled like wet earth, and the silence was almost suffocating. I tried to enjoy the stillness, but it was hard to ignore the eerie feeling that followed me as I walked deeper into the trees. It was near noon when I noticed something odd, a faint trail of disturbed dirt, as if someone had recently walked through the woods. It wasn't an animal's tracks. It was too wide, too irregular. I followed it for a while, my curiosity getting the best of me. But after about 20 minutes, the trail led to a small clearing, and then I saw it. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a small wooden structure. It was barely standing, a dilapidated shack half covered in vines and moss. The roof had caved in, and the walls were crumbling. But it wasn't the structure itself that caught my attention. It was the fact that someone had clearly been living there. I took a hesitant step closer and noticed a few items scattered on the ground. An old, rusted tin can, a half-burnt piece of wood, a discarded shoe. And then, in the center of the clearing, there was a pile of leaves and something underneath them. I knelt down, heart hammering in my chest. When I pulled away the leaves, I found something I'll never forget. A collection of broken tools, some covered in what looked like dried blood, and a pile of old, shredded clothing. My first thought was to turn and run, but I couldn't. Something about the place held me there, like I was being drawn into the past, into whatever happened here. That was the moment I knew I wasn't alone in the woods. By the time night fell, I was on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The cabin felt too small, too vulnerable. I spent the evening inside, trying to convince myself that everything would be fine, that I was overthinking it. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The knocking came again around midnight. This time it was louder, more frantic. My heart leapt into my throat, and I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys, ran to the truck, and drove straight back down the gravel path, not stopping until I hit the main road. I never went back to the cabin. In the end, I realized that whatever had happened there, whoever had left those bones and that pile of broken belongings, was still out there. I couldn't explain it, but I didn't need to. Some places aren't meant to be visited. Some things aren't meant to be uncovered. And sometimes it's better to just walk away. I don't think I'll ever forget that night, or the feeling of being watched by something or someone out in the dark. The woods don't forget, and neither will I. It was my first shift alone at the park ranger cabin, nestled in the thick woods of the Smoky Mountains. I had just recently transferred to this remote outpost, located about a 45-minute drive from the nearest town. The area was beautiful, quiet, and isolated, Exactly the kind of place I was looking for to escape the rush of city life. It wasn't my first time working as a ranger, but it was my first time handling a post like this, away from any immediate help. The cabin itself wasn't much, small, wooden, and old, but sturdy. It had everything I needed: a wood stove to keep warm, a few beds, some basic supplies. The land around it was mostly untouched, a dense forest stretching out for miles. I had been told that people rarely came through here, and even when they did, it was mostly hikers or hunters passing through, nothing that would disrupt the stillness of the place. For the first few days, that was exactly what I experienced. It was peaceful. I spent my time maintaining the trails, checking for any issues, and getting familiar with the land. But that evening, something felt different. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the clouds above were rolling in, thick and dark, warning of an impending storm. The radio in the cabin crackled to life. "Ranger Bill, can you copy?" It was Jake, my supervisor, checking in. We had a scheduled check-in every evening to make sure everything was running smoothly. "Copy, Jake," I responded. "Storm's rolling in fast. Just keep an eye on things. If the weather gets too bad, you know the drill, head to the main station. Otherwise, stay safe and keep your radio on." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Got it. Will do." I glanced out the small window of the cabin. The trees outside swayed ominously in the growing wind. The first drops of rain splattered against the glass. I stoked the fire in the stove, hoping to stay warm. I knew the storm would be a while before it reached its peak, but the cabin was so isolated, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. It was around 9:30 p.m. when the wind really started to howl, and the rain turned into a downpour. I had just finished securing the cabin when I heard a noise, a faint thud. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, listening. There it was again, a dull thump coming from the front porch. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe a branch hitting the cabin or something being knocked over by the storm. But no, this was rhythmic, deliberate. Thump, thump, like someone was walking slowly, dragging their feet across the wooden boards of the porch. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped toward the door. My hand hesitated over the knob. I knew this area well enough to know that it was unlikely anyone would be out there in this kind of weather. Even if they were, there was no trail to follow. But the noise kept coming, growing closer. My breath quickened as I reached for the door and opened it, shining the beam of my flashlight out into the darkness. Nothing, just the rain, pouring down like a curtain, and the trees rustling in the wind. The light reflected off the wet wooden boards of the porch, but there was no one there. I exhaled, feeling a bit foolish. Maybe I had imagined it. I closed the door and locked it behind me, still feeling uneasy, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me. I had just settled down by the fire again when the noise came a third time, this time louder. Thump, thump. I didn't hesitate this time. I grabbed my flashlight again, this time holding it tightly. I opened the door and stepped outside, scanning the area. The light flicked across the porch, then toward the ground. I knelt down, feeling the damp wood beneath my knees. There, in the rain-soaked soil, were fresh footprints, big, heavy ones, barefoot. They didn't belong to anyone I knew. No hiker or hunter would be out there barefoot in a storm like this. My heart pounded in my chest as I traced the prints with the beam of my flashlight. They were headed toward the edge of the woods, disappearing into the thick, dark forest. I stood up quickly, a sudden chill running down my spine. I knew there was no way anyone could have gotten here so quietly, especially without me hearing a car or seeing a light. The closest road was miles away. I stepped back into the cabin and locked the door behind me, trying to calm my racing thoughts. My instincts were on high alert. I checked the radio again, considering calling Jake, but I didn't want to overreact. Could have been an animal or some prankster hikers, I reasoned. But the footprints, those were not normal. They were large and spaced oddly, like someone or something was dragging one leg behind them. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I paced back and forth in the cabin, staring out the window. The storm was growing worse, and the sound of the wind and rain was now deafening. It was impossible to see anything beyond the edge of the porch, but I kept my flashlight trained on the door. My mind kept racing, jumping from one possible scenario to the next. Maybe it was a trespasser. Maybe someone was lost in the storm. But if they were lost, why hadn't they called for help? Why were they creeping around my cabin in the dead of night? As the hours ticked by, the storm intensified. The trees outside shook violently, and the wind screamed through the cracks in the walls. It felt like the entire world was being torn apart. My nerves were fraying. I couldn't stay inside any longer, but I couldn't leave either. I had to figure out what was going on. I pulled on my rain gear and grabbed my rifle from the corner. I wasn't sure if I'd need it, but I wasn't going to take any chances. The rain had slowed to a steady downpour, but it was still enough to make everything slippery and dangerous. I stepped outside again, this time heading towards the edge of the porch where the footprints began. The forest was darker than I had ever seen it, the trees blocking out all but the faintest sliver of moonlight. The air was thick with moisture, and the smell of wet earth and pine filled my nose. I could hear the distant sound of the storm, but it was muted here in the woods. I moved cautiously, keeping my rifle at the ready and scanning the trees. I followed the tracks as best I could, but they were becoming harder to see in the growing darkness. Whoever, whatever, had made them was moving quickly now, almost as if they knew I was following. The tracks led deeper into the woods, toward a small clearing. As I entered the clearing, I froze. There, in the center of the clearing, was something that made my stomach turn. A large, dark shape. It was crouched down, half hidden by the underbrush. It didn't move at first, but I could hear it breathing, slow and steady, like it was waiting for something, or someone. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. This was no animal.
No haike.
Whatever this was, it wasn't human. The shape slowly rose, towering over me, its form almost blending into the shadows of the trees. I could see nothing clearly, only the vague outline of a figure that didn't seem to belong. Suddenly, the wind shifted, and I smelled it. Something rancid, something rotten. The figure turned slightly, and I saw the eyes. They were wide, too wide, and they were staring directly at me. I don't know how long we stood there, just staring at each other in the darkness. But then it moved. It lunged forward, fast and terrifying. I raised the rifle instinctively, but the figure was already gone, slipping back into the trees like a shadow. I couldn't bring myself to chase it. I turned and ran back toward the cabin, my legs trembling beneath me. By the time I made it back inside, I slammed the door shut, locking it and bolting it, just as the storm reached its peak. I didn't sleep that night. The wind howled and the rain pounded against the cabin, but my mind was too preoccupied with what I had seen in the woods. The creature, or whatever it was, had been so unnatural, so alien. It wasn't just the way it looked. It was the way it moved, the way it knew I was there, the way it watched me without fear. I waited for morning. When it finally came, the storm had passed. The sky was clear, and the air was still. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone in these woods. And whatever that thing was, it was still out there. I haven't been back to that clearing since. I don't know if I ever will. But as I sit here, in this small, lonely cabin, I can still feel its eyes watching me from somewhere in the woods. And I don't think I'll ever be able to shake that feeling. My name is Eric. I was 33 years old the year I decided to build a cabin by myself. It was 2017. I was working as a warehouse supervisor in Central Oregon at the time, living in Bend. I'd been stacking money for about 4 years, living cheap, working long hours, not really going out. I didn't grow up with much, so I'd always been cautious with money. But I always had a picture in my head of owning something quiet, something far from the buzzing and the crowds. I liked my job, but I hated coming home to neighbors right up against the walls. Always some guy leaf blowing at 6 a.m., kids screaming out front, lights on all night. It was fine when I was in my 20s, but by 30 I just wanted quiet. I had my eye on a patch of forest land about 2 hours out, near a place called Chemult. You wouldn't even know it existed if you weren't from around there. Logging country, basically. Cold winters, heavy rains in the shoulder seasons, and long stretches of silence. The land was a little over 4 acres and cheap. No utilities, no water, no driveway, just dirt, trees, and wet air. I got it $4,7,000 cash. People thought I was crazy, but I knew I could build something small and strong with my own hands. I'd done construction for a couple years before I got into warehouse work. I knew how to frame, lay shingles, pour concrete. I wasn't great, but I wasn't clueless. I spent the better part of that summer clearing the site, marking it out, making little supply runs, watching the weather. I didn't have any heavy equipment, just a chainsaw, an axe, a shovel, and a wheelbarrow. I parked my truck off a gravel road about a quarter mile from the build site and hiked everything in. No driveway meant no easy access, and I didn't want to cut one in until I had something worth protecting. By October, I had a small foundation poured, 4 footings and 6 solid piers. It was enough to set a raised platform about 10 feet by 12. I planned to build it small, almost like a single-room shed cabin hybrid. Just a spot I could stay in when I wanted to get out. No electricity, no water, just with heat, lanterns, a cot, and some shelves. The first week of November brought the real rain. Cold, gray water that came down for days. That area doesn't just get showers, it gets soaked. Everything turns black and slick. I knew it was bad timing, but I didn't want to lose progress. I had a 3-day weekend coming, so I loaded the truck, checked the forecast, which only said rain, not storm, and headed out before sunrise Friday. It was still dark when I parked, just after 6 a.m. I didn't see any other cars along the gravel road, normal. No cell signal out there either, also normal. I hauled the first load, mostly framing lumber, tools, and a tarp, down the trail in the dark with a headlamp. My plan was to get the platform framed in before the worst of the rain hit. If I could get the floor done and cover it with a tarp, I could work under it and sleep inside it for the weekend. The first 2 hours went smooth. The rain was steady but not heavy, and I was making progress. By 10, I had the joists down and most of the subfloor installed. The edges were slick, and I slipped once trying to adjust a corner. Landed hard on my side. No injury, just a jolt. That's when I first noticed something odd. Not scary, just strange. There was a low, hollow noise coming through the trees, almost like someone beating on a hollow log. I stopped working and listened. It wasn't fast or rhythmic, just one low thump every 20 or 30 seconds. I figured it was a woodpecker on a dead tree, or maybe water dripping heavy on a stump. You hear all kinds of weird sounds in the woods when you stop to listen. I went back to work. By noon, the rain picked up. I strung a tarp over some trees and tied it down over the new platform so I could keep going. I was soaked from the waist down, and my gloves were basically useless, but I kept on framing the walls. I had the front and back framed by 4 when it got darker than usual. The clouds were thick, and it was already late fall. I decided I'd build until 6 and then hole up under the tarp for the night. I had a sleeping bag and foam mat, some food, and a little camping stove. I'd be fine. Around 5:30, as I was lifting one of the side walls to nail it in place, I heard something crack, like a branch snapping. Not a twig, a solid crack maybe 30 yards into the trees. I froze, held my breath, listened.
Rainon tarp.
Drips off branches, then nothing. I chalked it up to wind, went back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just the isolation, the cold, the silence. When you spend hours alone in the woods, your brain starts filling the quiet with things. I lit a small lantern and set it inside the tarp-covered platform. Ate some beef jerky, warmed up soup on the little stove. I stripped my wet pants and boots, pulled on dry thermals, and slid into the bag. The floor creaked when I moved. The tarp overhead flapped in the wind. The low thumping sound came back. Thump, thump, thump. Still distant, still irregular. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke up to silence. No wind, no tarp flapping, no rain hitting plastic. Just dead, deep silence. I checked my watch. 2:14 a.m. Then I heard it. That same low crack, like wood splitting, closer now. Maybe 20 feet off. I held still, barely breathing. Then a second crack. Not a branch falling. Not wind. This was pressure, something stepping, shifting weight on something wet and brittle. I sat up slowly, grabbed my flashlight, and clicked it on. Nothing outside the tarp. Just trees and wet dirt and the fog of my breath. The woods were dense around the build site. I hadn't cleared much beyond the pad itself, just enough to work. I stayed awake for an hour, heard nothing else. Eventually, the rain started again, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out to take a leak and found footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet. Large, human, bare footprints in the soft dirt beside the platform. They came out of the trees on one side, circled the build site once, and went back into the woods. I stood there, blinking at them in the rain. There were at least 6 distinct prints. They weren't huge, but definitely not animal. Toes, arches, heels. They looked like they belonged to a man. Judging by depth, he wasn't light either. There was no reason for someone to be out there barefoot. No camps nearby. No trail. No one knew I was out there. It was 40 degrees and pouring rain. I didn't panic, but I was alert. I kept working, hammered in silence. Took breaks to scan the tree line. Kept my tools close. I finished the walls and started the roof framing by late afternoon. The rain came and went. Everything smelled like wet cedar and soil. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything, but I felt it, that pressure in my chest, like eyes were on me. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed inside the half-framed cabin under the tarp with a hatchet by my side. I kept my boots on. Every few minutes, I checked the tree line with the flashlight. At 3 a.m., I thought I saw movement, a figure between 2 trees, tall, still, but when I blinked, it was gone. By sunrise, I made a decision. I was packing up and getting out. I wasn't scared exactly, but I wasn't going to test whatever was out there either. I left the cabin half-finished, loaded what I could carry, and hiked out. The trail back to the truck was wet and silent, but I wasn't alone. Halfway up the trail, I heard movement behind me. Steady, quiet steps matching mine. When I stopped, it stopped. When I walked, it walked. I didn't look back. When I reached the truck, I threw everything in the bed, jumped inside, locked the doors, and just sat there. That's when I saw the man. He stepped out of the woods about 30 feet behind the truck. No shirt, no shoes, just dark pants soaked to the knees. He was lean, pale, with long black hair stuck to his face. He didn't move, just stood there watching me through the rain. I started the truck and drove. I didn't stop until I was back in Bend. I never went back to that land. I sold it 2 months later to a guy from Klamath Falls. Didn't tell him anything. I still think about the cabin sometimes. It's probably rotting now. Half-finished walls, tarps sagging under snow. Maybe someone or something finished it, But not me. Never again. It was late September when I first saw the cabin, nestled deep in the woods. My name is James Carter, and at the time I was 31 years old. I had been hiking for hours, and the forest had grown thick and dense. The air was cool, the leaves scattered in shades of orange and red, a perfect backdrop for a quiet weekend getaway. I had heard about this cabin from a friend who used to go hunting up in the mountains and promised a peaceful retreat. It was an old hunting cabin, no longer in use, but it still stood tall, seemingly untouched by time. I had been hoping for a place to clear my mind. I had just gone through a tough breakup with Sarah, and work had been overwhelming. The solitude of the woods seemed like the perfect solution. I didn't plan on staying long, just a night or two to reset my brain and get back on track. The weather forecast was clear, and I had my gear, just the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, a few cans of food, and a book. I didn't expect anything unusual, but I should have. As I trekked deeper into the woods, the sun began to dip behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the trail. The cabin wasn't far now. I could feel the chill creeping in as the night approached. When I finally reached the cabin, I was relieved. It wasn't anything special, just a simple wooden structure, about the size of a small garage. Its roof was sagging in places, and the paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood weathered and gray. There was a stone chimney, but no smoke, no sign of life. Perfect place to be alone, I thought. I decided to stay inside. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The interior was surprisingly clean for an abandoned cabin. A single window, dirty but intact, allowed a sliver of light to shine through. There was a rough wooden table in the center of the room and a couple of chairs, though one was missing a leg. The only other thing in the room was a fireplace. It had clearly been used in the past but was now empty. I could smell the faintest scent of mildew, but overall it seemed safe enough. I set up my sleeping bag on the floor, next to the fireplace. The walls were bare, and there were no signs of life. The air outside had grown colder, and the wind picked up. The trees outside groaned under the pressure, their branches creaking and swaying like they were alive. I stoked the fireplace to keep warm, feeling a strange sense of comfort in the crackling flames. As the night wore on, I settled into my book. The sound of the wind outside was oddly calming, but every so often I would hear something, a light tap, a scratch. It was so faint that I initially dismissed it as the trees rustling against the cabin. But as the hours passed, the noises became more distinct, like something was moving outside. Maybe an animal. I told myself that. Maybe a raccoon or a deer wandering too close to the cabin. But the noises didn't stop. It was like they were circling the cabin, coming closer. My heart began to race. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, the branches. I stood up and went to the window to check. The night outside was pitch black. The only light came from the weak glow of the fire behind me. I couldn't see a thing, but I could hear it. A soft shuffle, followed by a loud thud. Something or someone was out there. I backed away from the window, my chest tight with unease. I grabbed my flashlight from my backpack and moved toward the door, slowly. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. My breath came in short bursts. I had to know what it was. Maybe it was just a stray animal. Maybe. I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, casting long shadows across the trees. I scanned the area, but saw nothing. Only the trees and the underbrush, swaying gently in the wind. I stood there for a while, listening. Nothing. Then I heard it again. A soft rustle, almost like something scraping against the ground. It was coming from the far side of the cabin, near the edge of the woods. My body tensed. I had the strange, inexplicable feeling that I wasn't alone. I hesitated, then walked toward the noise, my flashlight pointing toward the trees. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. My heart leaped in my chest, and I spun around, shining the light in every direction. But there was no one there, just the trees, the woods, nothing else. I returned to the cabin, my mind racing. It was too quiet now, too still. I locked the door behind me, more out of habit than because I thought anyone could get in. But the sounds hadn't stopped. They continued, now louder and closer, as if someone or something was moving just outside the walls of the cabin. I sat down by the fireplace, my hands clutching my knees, staring at the flames. I told myself it was just the wind, the animals. I was alone in the woods, and my mind was playing tricks on me. That's all. But the sounds persisted. The scraping, the tapping, now punctuated by what sounded like soft, muffled footsteps. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things, ready to leave. I'd find another place to camp, maybe head back to the car and go home early. But when I went to open the door, it wouldn't budge. I twisted the handle, pulling with all my might, but it was stuck. I kicked the door, but it didn't give. Panic surged through me. How could the door be stuck? I was sure it had opened just fine earlier. I stepped back, trying to think clearly. There had to be another way out. But when I looked around the room, the cabin felt different. The walls seemed to close in on me. The air was thick. It was like something was wrong, horribly wrong. And then I heard it again, louder this time. A scrape against the wood, like nails dragging across the floor. My blood ran cold. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Slowly, I turned, and that's when I saw it. There, in the corner of the room, behind the old wooden chair. A figure, tall, thin, and cloaked in shadows. I couldn't make out details, but the shape was unmistakable. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to spin, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse. But I forced myself to focus, to breathe. I had to get out. Now, I turned back to the door, throwing my weight against it. Finally, it gave way, swinging open with a loud creak. I ran into the night, my heart pounding, not looking back. I didn't care what it was. All I wanted was to get as far away as possible. The woods were silent now, almost too quiet. The cabin stood behind me, dark and ominous, but I didn't dare stop. I didn't know what I had seen, but I wasn't about to find out. By the time I reached my car, I didn't look back once. I drove through the night, my hands shaking on the wheel, my mind reeling. It wasn't until the sun started to rise that I allowed myself to breathe easier. I don't know what happened at that cabin, but I do know that I'll never return. The woods have a way of hiding things, and some things are better left alone. It was just another weekend away. At least that's what I thought when I first agreed to the trip. My friend, Dave, had been asking me for months to come along. He had just bought this small, isolated cabin in the woods, up in the mountains, and he'd been wanting to get away from the chaos of city life for a while. I had been hesitant, but when he mentioned it would just be the two of us, I figured it would be a good opportunity to reconnect and relax for a few days. Dave's cabin was located near a town called Maple Creek, about 2.5 hours northeast of where I lived in Seattle. I had never been to that part of the state before, and I wasn't sure what to expect. It was a small town, more like a village, really. The drive there had been uneventful, just long stretches of road that eventually wound their way through thick woods, and the occasional deer darting across the road. The weather had been overcast, but nothing too alarming. By the time I arrived at the cabin, it was already getting late in the afternoon, and the clouds above seemed to promise a storm later that night. Dave was already there when I pulled up in my truck. The cabin itself was pretty basic: wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a small front porch with an old rocking chair, and the smell of pine in the air. It looked like something you would see in a postcard for a secluded mountain retreat. The kind of place people fantasize about when they think of getting away from it all. "Glad you could make it," Dave called out as I got out of my truck. He was a tall guy with dark hair, his face marked by a few years of hard work. He was in his early 30s, a couple of years older than me. I nodded, feeling the cool air bite into my skin. The trees surrounding the cabin seemed to form an almost oppressive barrier, blocking out most of the light from the setting sun. "Looks great," I said, tossing my duffel bag onto the porch. The cabin's rustic charm wasn't lost on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. There was no one around for miles, and I hadn't realized just how far out in the middle of nowhere we were. "You'll love it," Dave said. "It's quiet, peaceful. No distractions." That night, we spent a couple of hours catching up, drinking beer, and sitting by the fire. The storm that had been hanging in the air finally broke around midnight, with heavy rain beating against the cabin's roof and the windows rattling with each gust of wind. The sound of the storm was almost soothing, drowning out the other noises that would have been more noticeable in silence. Around 2 a.m., Dave decided to call it a night. "I'm going to crash," he said, heading off to the room at the back of the cabin. "You should get some rest too. We can do some hiking tomorrow." I wasn't ready to sleep. Instead, I grabbed another beer from the cooler and sat on the porch, listening to the storm as it intensified. The rain was now coming down in sheets, and the wind had picked up so much that it made the trees sway. In the distance, I could see the occasional flash of lightning, followed by the rumble of thunder. I was lost in my thoughts when I heard a faint sound. At first, I couldn't place it. It was almost like a thud, muffled by the storm. I stood up, straining to listen. There it was again, a faint noise coming from the woods. I figured it was just the wind knocking something loose, or maybe an animal in the distance. But then, I heard it again, this time a little louder, followed by a slight rustling sound. I wasn't alone. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the thought of someone else being out there in the storm made me uneasy. The idea of a stranger in the woods, in the middle of nowhere, felt off. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But as the minutes passed, I became more certain I wasn't imagining things. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't making any effort to hide. I waited for the sound to come again, and it did, closer this time. The rustling was followed by a distinct crunching noise, like boots stepping on twigs. It was unmistakable. There was someone moving through the woods, and they were coming closer. My pulse quickened. I wasn't a paranoid person, but this felt wrong. I stepped inside, quietly closing the door behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest as I walked to the back of the cabin, where Dave was asleep. The door to his room was closed, but I could hear his even breathing. I grabbed my phone, though I knew there was no cell signal out here. It was more of a reflex, I guess, than anything else. I was trying to think of my options. The cabin was isolated. No one would hear you scream. If there was someone out there, I had no idea what their intentions were. I stepped back onto the porch, my eyes scanning the surrounding trees. Nothing. I couldn't see a damn thing in the darkness beyond the rain. I leaned against the cabin, trying to steady my breathing, and waited. Another minute passed. Then, just as I was about to turn around and go back inside, I saw it. A flash of movement, a shadow darting between the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't make out any details, just a figure moving quickly through the rain. The shadow disappeared into the darkness. That's when I realized. I had no idea how far out in the woods I was. The nearest neighbor was miles away. If something went wrong, if I got hurt, no one would come. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I didn't want to alarm Dave, but I had to. I knocked on his door, softly at first, but then harder when I didn't hear him stir. "Dave!" I called out quietly, but he didn't answer. I opened the door, my stomach turning as I stepped inside. He wasn't in the bed. My heart skipped a beat. The room was dark, but I could see the bed had been disturbed, like he had gotten up and left in a hurry. I quickly searched the cabin, but Dave was nowhere to be found. My first instinct was to grab my stuff and leave, but I couldn't just abandon him. He might have gone to check on something outside. I couldn't let myself panic, even though I felt like I was about to lose control. I stepped back onto the porch, feeling the rain soak through my jacket. I squinted into the woods, looking for any sign of Dave. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again, a figure in the trees. It was standing still, just watching. I didn't know what to do. I had to get back inside the cabin, lock the door, and wait until daylight. I turned around to go inside, but then I saw something that froze me in place. Dave was standing in the doorway, his face pale and wide-eyed, his clothes soaked through. I ran toward him. "Where the hell have you been?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't say anything, just kept staring at me. I reached out to grab his shoulder, but the second my hand made contact, he jerked away, his eyes wide with fear. "It's not him," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "There's someone else here. We need to go. Now." That was when I saw it. Behind Dave, standing just a few feet away in the doorway, was another figure. A tall man, with a dark hood pulled low over his face. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at us. I felt my blood run cold. Dave was trembling. He didn't seem to recognize the man. Neither did I. The man stepped forward, slowly, his footsteps almost silent despite the heavy rain. I backed away, instinctively pushing Dave behind me. The stranger's eyes glinted with an unnatural intensity, and for a moment, I wondered if I had made a huge mistake by coming here. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned and disappeared back into the trees. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, but I couldn't leave the cabin. "Not like this. Let's just stay inside," Dave said, his voice shaky. "We'll figure it out in the morning." And that's exactly what we did. We spent the rest of the night awake, listening to the storm rage on outside, too afraid to sleep. The man never came back. We never heard any more noises from the woods. In the morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind only a light drizzle. We packed our things quickly, loaded up the truck, and drove out of there without looking back. I never did find out who the man was. To this day, I still don't know if he was just someone lost in the woods or something else entirely. What I do know is that after that night, I never went back to that cabin. It's still there, up in the woods, but I've heard rumors that someone else bought it. They say they hear strange noises at night, like footsteps in the trees. But for me, I'll never know what happened. All I know is some places are best left undisturbed, and some woods are better left unexplored. It was late, the kind of late when everything feels quiet, as if the world is holding its breath. I hadn't meant to pass her cabin. I was just driving, trying to clear my head. It had been a year since we'd split, a year of trying to forget, of trying to move on. But something about the drive, something about that stretch of road, always brought my thoughts back to her, to what we'd had, and to what we'd lost. The headlights of my truck cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow road ahead. The trees on either side just dark shadows against the night sky. I didn't recognize it at first, but then the familiar shape of her cabin came into view. The old wooden house, nestled between the trees, its porch light dim but still on. I should have just turned around, kept going. But for some reason, I didn't. Maybe it was the thought of seeing her things again, of remembering how it used to be, or maybe it was just the pull of the place itself, our place. I pulled off the road, my tires crunching against the gravel as I parked just out of sight, a few yards down the hill. The cabin was quiet, like it always was when she wasn't there. It had been months since I last saw her, and even though I knew she wasn't home, I couldn't help but feel like I was intruding. But the urge to look, to take one more look, was too strong. I stepped out of the truck, the cold air hitting my face. It was the kind of crisp night where you could almost taste the chill. My boots sunk slightly into the wet grass as I walked up the hill, every step seeming too loud in the silence. The trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying just enough to make the shadows dance in the moonlight. The porch light flickered as I approached the cabin, casting an eerie glow on the front door. It was unlocked. She used to leave it unlocked, even when she wasn't home, a habit I'd never understood but had always respected. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the doorknob. A wave of guilt hit me. I wasn't supposed to be here, but then again, I hadn't come for her. I wasn't here to beg for answers or closure. Not anymore. I just wanted to see the place one last time, to remind myself of the life we'd built and the life I'd lost. The door creaked open as I pushed it, stepping inside. The smell of pine and wood smoke filled the air. The cabin was just as I remembered it. Cozy, comfortable, a place where I could almost forget the rest of the world. The couch was still there, the rug on the floor, the framed pictures of us on the wall. It felt like she had just stepped out for a moment and would be back soon. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt the weight of the silence. It wasn't just the absence of her. It was something else, something unsettling. The air felt thick, charged somehow, like something had shifted. I made my way through the cabin, taking in the familiar sights. Her books still sat on the shelf. The kitchen counters were cluttered with little things she used to leave around, the scent of her favorite candle lingering in the air. But then I saw it, a small detail I hadn't noticed before. There, on the kitchen table, was a letter. It was folded, plain, nothing special, but something about it stood out to me. It was addressed to me in her handwriting. My heart skipped a beat. She hadn't contacted me in months. There was no reason for her to write to me, yet here it was, lying on the table, waiting for me to open it. I almost didn't. I thought about leaving, about walking away from this whole mess, but curiosity won out. I picked up the letter, unfolded it carefully, and started reading. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that I wasn't prepared for. Sam, I don't know where to start, or if I should even send this, but something feels wrong, and I need you to know. There's something happening here, something I can't explain. I felt it for weeks, but I couldn't put it into words until now. Please, if you get this, come back to the cabin. I don't feel safe anymore. I don't know who else to turn to. The letter was dated just a few days before, and as I finished reading it, a chill ran through me. The last time I had been here, everything had seemed fine. But now, reading this, something didn't add up. Why hadn't she called me? Why hadn't she told me any of this before? I stood there, holding the letter, my mind racing. I knew I should leave. I should get back in the truck and drive away. Forget I ever saw the letter. But the thought of her, scared and alone, left me frozen in place. I turned toward the window, my eyes scanning the dark forest beyond. The trees were still, the only movement coming from the wind. But then I saw it, a flicker of movement, something out there, just beyond the tree line. I couldn't make out exactly what it was, but the feeling that crept over me made my skin crawl. I wasn't alone. I set the letter down and grabbed my flashlight, heading for the door. The sudden urge to leave, to get out of there, was overwhelming. But something told me I couldn't just walk away. Not now. Not after what I had read. I stepped outside and into the night, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was colder now, and the silence had deepened. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the leaves seemed amplified in the stillness. I walked around the cabin, trying to shake off the sense of unease gnawing at me. I reached the side of the cabin and froze. There, in the shadows, standing at the edge of the tree line, was a figure, tall, unmoving. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, a trick of the light or the wind, but as I focused, the figure didn't move. It was watching me. I felt my heart race. My first instinct was to call out, to demand answers, but I stopped myself. I didn't know who or what this was. I took a slow step back, trying to make myself as small as possible, keeping the beam of the flashlight steady on the figure. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, as if it were waiting for something. Then, without warning, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. My breathing was heavy, and I realized that I had no idea who that was or what they were doing here. But one thing was clear: whatever had been going on here wasn't just in her head. I hurried back to the truck, heart pounding, mind racing. I wasn't going to stick around to find out more. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that whatever was happening here was bigger than just a fear of being alone. But then, just as I rounded the corner, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A car parked on the road ahead, just sitting there. It wasn't a car I recognized, and the person inside, whoever they were, wasn't moving. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had to get out of there. I wasn't just passing by anymore. I was in the middle of something I didn't understand, and the more I tried to run from it, the more it seemed to follow. But I didn't stop. I didn't turn back. And somehow that night, despite all the fear, despite all the unknowns, I made it through. I drove back to town, where the lights were bright and the noise of life was still normal. But I knew one thing for sure. The cabin had changed, and so had everything about the life I thought I'd left behind. The day started off like any other, a crisp, dry morning in the fall. I had driven out of the city, heading north toward a small, forgotten patch of forest that was supposed to be peaceful. A cabin that had been in the family for years. It wasn't much, a simple, weather-beaten structure tucked into the woods, surrounded by a cemetery that hadn't been cared for in decades. My uncle, who had passed recently, left it to me, and after much thought, I decided it was time to visit. The gravel road leading up to the cabin was uneven, with patches of mud and deep ruts carved into the earth from years of neglect. The trees above towered over me, their branches a network of thick fingers stretching out to block the sun. It felt like the air was heavier here, thick with dampness that clung to my skin as I breathed in. My car's tires crunched over the gravel, and I could hear the occasional snap of a twig in the woods surrounding me. The cemetery wasn't large, just a collection of old headstones that barely stood upright anymore. Overgrown grass and ivy curled up their sides, some so worn that the names etched into the stones were unreadable. I had grown up hearing stories about this place, about how the graveyard was once a site of tension between families, about the local legends of curses and strange happenings. But those were just stories. I had come to the cabin for solitude, not to dwell on the past. My uncle's death had stirred up enough memories of my family and their distant ties to this cabin. I parked my car at the edge of the property, its engine cutting off with a final click. The silence hit me like a weight as I stepped out into the chill. I should have grabbed a jacket, but it was too late now. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The old cabin to my left, the cemetery in front of me, and the dense woods behind, stretching out like an impenetrable wall. The cabin wasn't much to look at. It was a simple wooden structure, one story, with a sagging porch and peeling paint. The roof had seen better days, too, but it was still standing strong, and that was enough for me. I wasn't here to impress anyone. I wanted quiet, isolation, time to think. The graveyard loomed in the background, a constant reminder of the past that I couldn't escape, but I ignored it. I wasn't afraid of ghosts, and the cemetery didn't scare me. It just felt like part of the landscape, something I'd have to deal with for the next few days. I made my way inside, the door creaking loudly on its hinges. Dust motes swirled in the air as I stepped over the threshold. The cabin was dark, with only a few streaks of light piercing through the cracks in the wooden walls. The smell of old wood and mildew hit me immediately, a sharp contrast to the fresh air outside. The furniture was sparse, mostly old pieces that looked like they'd been around longer than I had. An armchair by the fireplace, a worn rug, a small dining table that seemed too small for anything more than a single meal. I walked over to the windows, pulling open the thick curtains. The view was breathtaking. The cemetery, framed by the dense woods, felt miles away in that moment, though it was only a short walk down a narrow trail. But something about the way the light hit the gravestones made the scene feel off, almost as if the cemetery had its own presence. I shrugged off the feeling and unpacked my things. There was no need to dwell on the past. This place was just a cabin, nothing more. As the evening drew near, I started a fire in the small stone fireplace. The sound of crackling would fill the cabin, and the warmth spread throughout the room. I settled into the old armchair, a glass of whiskey in my hand, and let the calm of the place seep into me. But as the fire burned low and the night deepened, I began to feel an unease. It wasn't the kind of fear that made you jump at every sound. It was more like a nagging discomfort, the kind that makes you check the windows, then check them again. I told myself it was just the isolation, the silence. I hadn't been alone in a place like this for a long time. The wind picked up outside, and the trees started to rustle in a way that felt off. The branches creaked like old bones, and the occasional gust of wind made the cabin groan as if it, too, were unsettled. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. Something about the graveyard behind the cabin seemed to pull at my thoughts. I forced myself to focus on the fire, but my eyes kept flicking toward the window, toward the shadowy figures that seemed to move just beyond the reach of the light. I stood up, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside onto the porch, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The night was cold now, the air biting at my skin. I scanned the woods, the flashlight beam darting back and forth, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The cemetery, too, was still, the stones standing like silent sentinels in the dark. But there was something in the air, something heavy. I felt it in my bones, a tension that I couldn't explain, but it was there, pulsing in the silence. I turned back to the cabin and stepped inside, locking the door behind me. The fire had nearly gone out, and the cabin felt colder than it had before. I huddled closer to the dwindling flames, but even that didn't seem to warm me. The unease was too strong now, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Hours passed, and I tried to sleep, but the sound of the wind outside, the occasional creak of the cabin's frame, kept me awake. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, willing myself to fall asleep. Then I heard it, a sound distant at first, but then growing louder. A slow, rhythmic thudding, like something walking, not on the trail, but out in the graveyard. I held my breath, straining to hear. Thud, thud, thud. My heart started to race. I wasn't imagining this. Someone or something was out there. I reached for the flashlight, grabbed it, and crept to the window. My hand shook as I pulled the curtain aside just a little. The cemetery was barely visible, the gravestones shrouded in darkness. But there was movement, a figure, cloaked in shadow, walking slowly among the stones. My pulse quickened. I shouldn't have come here. I shouldn't have stayed. I stayed still, watching until the figure stopped, standing still in the cemetery. It was too far away to make out details, but the shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin, and it was facing the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I was frozen, unable to move, my mind racing. Who would be out there at this hour? What were they doing in the graveyard? I waited, watching, as the figure remained motionless. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it turned and disappeared behind one of the larger tombstones, vanishing into the darkness. I didn't wait. I grabbed my jacket, threw open the door, and rushed outside, the cold air slapping my face. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't just let it go. The cemetery was only a short walk away, but with every step I took, the unease grew. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, pressed in on me from every direction. The trees groaned in the wind, their branches scratching against each other like whispers. I reached the cemetery and stood at its edge, my flashlight sweeping over the graves. Everything looked still, silent, but then I saw it. A figure, crouched low behind a gravestone, watching me. I froze, my blood running cold. It was the same shape from before, but closer now. Much closer. The figure slowly stood, its long arms stretching upward, the tall silhouette blocking out the light from the moon. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't run. Couldn't. I had to know what this was. I took a step forward, and that's when I heard it. A voice. Not words, but a low, guttural sound like something far too old to be human. It was coming from the figure, but I didn't stay long enough to figure it out. I ran back to the cabin, heart pounding in my ears. The door slammed behind me, and I locked it as fast as I could. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know this. The cemetery wasn't just a place for the dead. It was a place for things far worse. By the time I left the cabin the next morning, the figure was gone. But I still haven't forgotten it, and I don't think I ever will. The rain was falling harder than I had expected. It wasn't just the usual drizzle or gentle downpour that you can shrug off. No, this was one of those storms that seemed to shake the very air, coming down in sheets, hammering the cabin's roof in a way that made the whole place feel like it was trembling. I sat by the window, staring out at the dark forest, the shadows of trees swaying under the relentless wind. The world outside was blurred by the sheets of rain, and I could barely make out anything past the edge of the porch. A thick mist had begun to crawl in, wrapping everything in a ghostly veil. But there was nothing ghostly about it. It was just weather, and the kind of weather you don't want to be out in. I had rented this cabin for the weekend to get some quiet time, just me and my dog, a big German shepherd named Max. He had been at my side for nearly 6 years, and we'd spent more nights than I could count in various cabins, campsites, and hiking trails across the country. But this cabin was different. It sat at the edge of a small, secluded town in the mountains of North Carolina, miles away from the nearest gas station or neighbor. The owners had warned me that the road up was narrow and winding, especially when the weather got rough. But I didn't think it would be this bad. Max was curled up beside the wood stove, his tail occasionally flicking as he snoozed. The fire crackled, filling the cabin with a warmth that felt almost too good given how cold and wet it was outside. I reached down and scratched Max behind his ears. He stirred, gave me a sleepy look, and then laid his head back down. He was always good company, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right tonight. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was the isolation. I'd been alone in cabins before, but tonight felt different, more oppressive somehow. It was around 10 p.m. when it started. There was a sound outside, faint at first, like something moving in the brush. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe a deer wandering through the woods. But then it came again, a crack of a twig, a soft shuffle of feet. Max's ears perked up, and he raised his head, staring at the door as if he had heard it too. His nose twitched, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I grabbed the flashlight that was sitting on the coffee table, clicked it on, and stood up, careful not to disturb Max. I walked to the door and peered out the small window, but the rain and mist made it impossible to see anything. Just the blurry outlines of trees, the dark shapes shifting in the wind. The light from inside reflected off the wet glass, obscuring any view I might have had. Another sound, closer this time. Max growled low, the sound a rumble from deep in his chest, and I knew he wasn't just being paranoid. There was something out there. I could feel it, a sense of unease that was growing stronger with every passing second. My first instinct was to grab the gun I'd brought with me, but I didn't want to escalate things before I knew what was going on. Instead, I quietly unlocked the door, crept outside with Max by my side, and stood on the porch, straining my ears. The storm had drowned most of the usual forest sounds, but now, in the quiet between the gusts of wind, I could hear it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the wet ground just beyond the edge of the trees. I scanned the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know if I was imagining it, but there seemed to be something moving out there, just out of reach of the flashlight's beam. I called to Max, a soft whisper of his name, and he responded by stiffening, his muscles taut. He wasn't growling now, just watching, alert. His hackles were raised. I wasn't sure if it was a person or an animal, but I had learned long ago to trust Max's instincts. I decided to go back inside and keep the door unlocked, just in case. My mind raced as I closed it behind me, trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to overreact, but I also didn't want to be caught off guard. Whatever it was no longer just an animal wandering the woods. There was a purpose to its movements. It was circling the cabin. I sat on the couch, still holding the flashlight, and waited. Max laid down again but stayed tense, his eyes fixed on the door. The wind howled outside, but I could still hear the soft rustle of leaves and branches as whatever was out there moved closer, edging around the cabin, testing for weaknesses. And then, without warning, there was a knock at the door. The sound was muffled by the rain but unmistakable. 3 distinct knocks, slow, measured, as if the person knew I was inside and was waiting for me to answer. My breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to run, to lock myself in the bathroom and call for help, but there was nowhere to go. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and cell service was spotty at best. I had no choice but to face whatever was at the door. I looked at Max, and for the first time in our years together, he looked unsure. His eyes flicked from the door to me, then back again. I stood up slowly, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, and approached the door. The rain was still falling hard, and I hesitated before opening it, my heart racing. My fingers brushed the handle, and as I turned it, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever was out there. I threw open the door. The cold air hit me first, a gust of wind that made me step back and shiver. There was nothing there, just the porch, slick with rain, and the dark woods stretching out beyond. My eyes scanned the ground, the trees, the shadows, but there was no one in sight. I stood there for a moment trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined the knocks? Had someone been messing with me, playing a prank? It didn't seem likely. The isolation of this cabin made that kind of joke almost impossible. I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me, but something felt wrong. Max was on his feet again, his tail stiff, his ears pricked up. His nose was twitching, sniffing the air. He suddenly bolted to the window, growling low in his throat. I followed him, my nerves on edge, and looked outside. For the first time, I saw something that made my stomach drop. In the distance, just on the edge of the woods, there was a figure standing still, facing me. The person, or whatever it was tall, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the night, and they were watching me, watching the cabin. My pulse raced. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there perfectly still. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't let this person get any closer. I grabbed my phone, dialed the number of the rental owner, but the call wouldn't go through. Of course it wouldn't. No signal, just like I knew. Max barked once, a sharp, harsh bark that broke the silence, and the figure slowly turned and began to walk into the woods, vanishing into the darkness. I didn't wait to see if they were coming back. I locked every window, every door, and checked the perimeter of the cabin, making sure everything was secure. Max stayed close, his body tense as he watched me move around. His presence was a comfort, but it didn't stop the knot in my stomach. I spent the rest of the night pacing, keeping the lights off and the cabin silent, trying to listen for anything out of the ordinary. The storm raged on, and the wind howled against the walls. But as the hours passed, the fear that had gripped me slowly began to fade. By morning, the rain had stopped, the mist was lifting, and the forest was quiet once more. There was no sign of the figure, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. It was as if they had never been there at all. I stayed the rest of the weekend, though I didn't sleep much. Max and I spent our days exploring the nearby trails, and the nights were peaceful. The cabin felt less like a prison and more like a home again. But I never forgot what had happened. The knock at the door, the figure in the woods. It stayed with me, a constant reminder of just how fragile our sense of safety can be. When I left, I made sure to leave a note for the owners about the strange events of the weekend. I didn't know if they would believe me, but I had to tell someone. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was something worse. But I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't be coming back. I wasn't supposed to be alone that night. That's what everyone told me. My friends, my family, they all warned me not to go up to the cabin by myself. It wasn't the first time I had stayed in that cabin. It had been my grandfather's place up in the woods, tucked away far enough to be isolated, but close enough to feel a slight safety from the world. A little more than 2 hours north of where I lived, it was in a remote stretch of woods. My grandfather had passed years ago, and I'd inherited the cabin, along with the property around it. It was a quiet place, one where the hum of the city and the noise of everyday life seemed to vanish with every mile I drove. The cabin itself was old, with wooden beams that creaked, the smell of pine and damp earth seeping into every corner. I had always found it peaceful, a retreat. No one else seemed to have the same fondness for it, though. It was too quiet for them, too far off the beaten path. But for me, it was perfect. It gave me room to think, room to breathe. And on this particular night, I needed that. I had come up here with the intention of clearing my head. Work had been overwhelming. My relationship was on the rocks, and I needed a break. I didn't tell anyone I was coming, just needed to be by myself for a while. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun started to dip behind the horizon. I unloaded my things and started the fire in the cabin's old wood stove, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. There was something about the solitude of the cabin at night that felt comforting. The wind whistling through the trees, the occasional distant hoot of an owl. It was like the world outside the cabin didn't exist. But that night, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, an unease that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I brushed it off as nothing more than my overactive imagination. As the night wore on, I settled in front of the fire with a book, but I couldn't focus. Every now and then, I would hear a sound from outside. The snap of a twig, the rustling of leaves, the faintest scratching against the cabin's wooden walls. I told myself it was just animals, deer, maybe a raccoon or two, but something about it made my skin crawl. I decided to go outside and check. The wind was sharp, biting at my face, but I figured a little fresh air might clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped on my boots, and stepped out the door. The moment the door closed behind me, a chill ran down my spine. The forest around the cabin was darker than usual, the trees looming like twisted, silent sentinels in the moonlight. I walked around the cabin, shining the flashlight into the shadows. Nothing seemed out of place. A couple of deer had passed through the clearing earlier, their prints visible in the soft mud. But then something caught my eye, movement. At the edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line, I saw a figure standing still. I froze. At first, I thought it might be another person, someone who had wandered off the trail or gotten lost. But there was no reason anyone would be out here at this hour. And there was something about the way the figure stood, motionless, watching. It didn't seem natural. I squinted into the darkness, the flashlight beam flickering in my hand. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I called out, my voice betraying the fear I tried to suppress. "Hello!" Nothing. The figure remained still, like it was waiting for something. My heart began to race, and I took a step back toward the cabin, trying not to make any sudden movements. I knew I had to get inside, lock the door, and never look back. But I couldn't stop myself from glancing once more at the figure before I retreated. That was when it moved. At first, I thought I was seeing things. The figure wasn't walking. It was gliding, moving smoothly and unnaturally fast between the trees. It was like it wasn't touching the ground, more like it was drifting toward me. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root in the ground, and before I could even process what was happening, the figure stopped, dead in its tracks, just at the edge of the clearing. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't run. I couldn't even think straight. My instincts told me to stay still, not to make any more noise. Then, out of nowhere, there was a sound. A sharp, high-pitched screech that echoed through the woods. It was like something had been scraped across metal or a horrible, inhuman wail. I didn't know where it came from, but I was certain it came from the figure. The air felt heavier now, the night darker, as though the world was pressing in on me. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted toward the cabin, my boots pounding against the soft ground. My hands fumbled for the key in my pocket, and as soon as I reached the door, I slammed it behind me. I locked it, checked the windows, and double-checked the locks. Then I stood there in the dark, listening. Nothing, just silence. I didn't sleep that night. My mind raced, replaying the events in my head, trying to make sense of them. But there was no sense to make.
No explanación.
I wasn't crazy. I knew what I saw. The figure, the screech. Whatever it wasn't normal. The next morning, I decided to pack up and leave. I didn't care how short my trip had been. I just wanted to get out of there. But as I packed my things, I kept hearing those same sounds again. The scratching, the rustling, coming from outside the cabin. I looked out the window, but I didn't see anything. Not even the figure, just the endless expanse of trees. I rushed to my truck, packed everything up, and left as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I drove down the gravel road. The entire trip back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that I wasn't alone. It wasn't until a few weeks later, after returning home, that I realized something. I had left the cabin that night with one of my grandfather's old hunting knives. I hadn't taken it on purpose. It must have just been packed in the bag with my things. I hadn't noticed it until I unpacked. But what made me uneasy wasn't just that I had taken it. It was the fact that the blade had been used. There was dirt and blood on it. And the thing that made my stomach drop was that it wasn't my blood. The blood had been fresh. Too fresh. I never went back to that cabin. The sound of my boots crunching through the dry, fallen leaves echoed through the dense forest. My name is Mark, and I've been hunting these woods for years. It's a tradition in my family, an escape, a way to unwind, to remind myself of the simplicity of life. This time, though, things felt different. The woods felt heavier, more alive somehow. The hunt was supposed to be like any other. The same place, the same small cabin tucked in the middle of the forest. I had been there a dozen times before. My grandfather had built it, and for as long as I could remember, it had been a place of solace, a refuge from the noise of the world. But this year, I felt a strange tug in the pit of my stomach. Maybe it was just the weight of a long, stressful year, work, family matters, everything piling up. But I couldn't shake it. The cabin was about 2 miles in, hidden deep in the woods where no one else ever came. Even though I was used to this area, every step I took felt like a step into unknown territory. As I moved deeper into the woods, the familiar trees and trails felt unfamiliar. The usual crisp scent of pine seemed clouded, muffled. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked the same. A small, weathered structure with a stone chimney, sitting atop a small hill. The roof was covered in moss, the wood a faded gray from years of exposure to the elements. It was almost as if time stood still here. I put my gear down on the porch and unlocked the door. The inside was just as I remembered. A wood-burning stove in the corner, an old dining table with mismatched chairs, and a cozy feeling of isolation. I set up camp quickly. The weather had been unpredictable lately. Sunny one moment, rain the next, and I didn't want to risk getting caught out in the woods with a storm. As night started to fall, I stoked the fire inside the cabin. The flames flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The wind outside began to pick up, rattling the windows. I was alone this trip, which was nothing new. My usual hunting buddy, Steve, had decided not to come. Something about work and family commitments, though I suspected he was just getting too old for this kind of thing. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I preferred it. But as the night wore on, I couldn't ignore the feeling of unease growing in the back of my mind. Around midnight, I heard a sound from outside. A crack, like a twig breaking underfoot. It wasn't the wind. I knew that. The wind was constant, but this was something else. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed my rifle, quietly moving to the window. The forest outside was dark, the trees casting long, eerie shadows in the moonlight. There was no movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I sat by the window, the rifle resting on my knees. I didn't know what to expect. A deer, maybe, or perhaps a bear, although they usually stayed away from the cabin. But whatever it was, I knew it wasn't a typical night. The sound came again, another crack, closer this time. I couldn't explain it, but my gut told me to stay quiet, to wait. I didn't turn on any lights. The darkness outside made it impossible to see clearly, but I didn't dare leave the safety of the cabin. The feeling of being watched had started to creep over me, a slow, insidious sensation that tightened my chest. The night seemed impossibly still. Suddenly, the door rattled. It wasn't a knock. No, it was a jolt, as if something had slammed into the side of the cabin. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Another jolt, this one harder, followed by the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the wood. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. I slowly crept over to the door, rifle still in hand. My breath was shallow, the silence of the cabin amplifying every movement I made. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to hear anything on the other side. All I could hear was my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I opened the door just a crack, peering into the blackness outside. The wind had died down, but the air felt charged, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Nothing moved.
No sounds. No whispers.
but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I pulled the door back, bolting it shut again. I moved toward the back of the cabin, eyes scanning every corner of the room, every shadow. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation for what was happening. Maybe it was an animal, a bear, or something larger. Or perhaps someone was out there trying to scare me. But as the night dragged on, I began to doubt my own reasoning. The hours stretched on and I stayed awake, listening. The occasional scrape against the wood, the eerie howling of the wind, and that growing sense that I wasn't alone. I thought I saw a flash of movement outside the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Finally, I decided to make my way to the hunting blind in the morning. I needed some clarity. My nerves were getting the better of me, and I needed to prove to myself that I was just overthinking things. I gathered my gear and stepped out into the cold morning light, determined to ignore the feeling that had been gnawing at me since last night. As I walked through the forest toward the blind, I noticed something strange. The ground around the cabin was littered with broken branches, leaves trampled down in a way that didn't look natural. My first thought was that an animal had been around, but there was something about it that felt deliberate. I could see where something or someone had moved through the underbrush, creating a path that led deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed the trail. The further I went, the more uneasy I became. The trees seemed denser and the shadows longer. There was no sign of wildlife, no birds, no small animals, just an eerie stillness. I finally reached a clearing where I saw something that made my blood run cold. A man, a tall figure standing perfectly still in the center of the clearing. He was dressed in dark, weathered clothing that blended into the surroundings, and his face was obscured by the brim of a hat. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, staring straight ahead. For a moment, I thought I might be imagining it, but the longer I looked, the more certain I became that he was real, and that he was waiting for something. I took a step back, but the movement seemed to alert him. Slowly, he turned his head toward me, and I froze. His eyes were the only thing I could see clearly, cold, empty, like the eyes of a predator. He didn't smile, didn't make a sound. He just watched me, and the weight of his gaze made me feel like I was suffocating. I turned and ran. The forest seemed to close in around me as I sprinted back toward the cabin. The man didn't chase me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching. I stumbled, my heart pounding in my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving. When I finally reached the cabin, I locked the door and collapsed against it, gasping for air. I was safe for now, but the image of that man stayed with me, and the feeling of being hunted lingered long after I'd caught my breath. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed by the fire, rifle in hand, waiting for the dawn. As morning light began to filter through the trees, I knew what I had to do. I packed up my things, cleaned the cabin, and left without a second thought. I never went back to that cabin. The woods were silent that day, and as I drove away, I couldn't help but feel like I was leaving something behind, something that wasn't quite human. I never learned who the man was or what he was doing out there in the woods. Maybe he was just a wanderer, maybe a hermit, or maybe something far worse. But one thing was clear: I wasn't meant to find out.